I'm 6 years old. This is not the start of a story. I'm telling you, I'm currently 6 years old. And I know you're looking at me and you're saying, no, you're a big, strong, handsome man. Or at least that's what my wife should be saying. But genuinely, no matter how old I grow, there's always going to be this 6-year-old voice inside of me that is the most central part of who I am. Just wanting to bring the people around me as much happiness and peace as I possibly can. I don't know if this happened from birth or if this is something that happened because of the thing that happened when I was 6 years old. When I was 6 years old, my mom's youngest brother was shot and killed by the police, steps outside of our front door. My mom, my dad, and my grandma all watched this happen. And even though I wasn't physically there, and nobody in my family ever talked about what happened, I could still feel the weight of it everywhere I was. It was worst when I would see my mom in our home and I would feel this pain on her body. She would walk down the hallway of our home with this tension in her body that I couldn't see on her face, but I could feel in my body. She would walk into her room, she would close the door, and the second she'd close the door, I'd feel this rush of emotions crashing into my body. I'd feel it on my chest, I'd feel it on my shoulders, it'd go up into my throat until it felt like I couldn't breathe. It was like as if a tsunami had hit, and I was drowning in the wake. It was so overwhelming, I would rush into my own room. I would climb onto my bed, curl up, and put my hands over my head, trying to push everything I was feeling down, just hoping that the storm would pass. I hated watching my mom go into her room, and to know deep in my body how much pain she was in. And so I never talked about what happened. Nobody in my family did, and I was completely fine with this. I moved on with my life, and everything was great. Until I had sons of my own. And I started to see the ways my silence and my family's silence was starting to show up in their lives. Today, I want to talk to you about the danger of silence and the power of a single voice. There are many times when my son showed me the danger of silence, but one of the most memorable happened on a sunny day in May of 2020. I was sitting in my home, at my table at my kitchen, holding my phone in my hand, about to watch a video that I did not want to watch. It was the video with Ahmaud Arbery in it. Initially, I told myself from the very beginning, I'm not going to watch this video. I already know how it ends. And every single time I watch one of these videos, they pull me into this really dark place that's hard for me to get out of. And so I said, I'm not going to watch this video. I'm going to move on. But then the story was everywhere. People were talking about it. It was all over the news. And slowly, I started to see images and clips pop up all over social media. And I knew that this video would find me whether I wanted to watch it or not. And rather than have it pop up and surprise me, I decided I should sit down and watch this when I can be a little bit in control. And so I sit down at my kitchen table, I grab my phone in my hand, I plug my earphones in, and I find the video, and I push play. And initially when I'm seeing the people running around the trucks, I'm doing fine, but as soon as I hear the gunshots, I feel myself being pulled into that really dark place. Tears are starting to stream into my eyes, my nose is starting to run. It's this really ugly cry that I'm trying to fight off when my 5-year-old son walks out of the bedroom that he shares with his 8-year-old brother. And he walks right up to the table where I'm sitting, and he looks up at me and he says, "Can I see Daddy?" And as soon as he asked me those words, I just viscerally just like shooed him away and said, "Not right now, maybe later." And I see him hang his head, turn around and walk away disappointed, and I feel terrible for having shut him down that way. But I also just couldn't imagine putting the full weight of this moment on him. It wasn't about race for me. It was about everything that was happening between the pandemic and all the dead bodies that were being piled up in the refrigerated trucks less than half a mile from our home in Brooklyn, all the violence, the uncertain state of the world. How could I put the weight of that on this little 5-year-old? And so I got up from the table, wiped away my tears, jammed my phone into my pocket. My sons were actually waiting to play a game with me, a game of Roblox on their iPads, and I composed myself and I walked into their room. I found a spot on the blue and white area rug, and I sit down in front of the bunk bed, and I'm like, "You guys ready to play?" And my 8-year-old son sits up super fast. He grabs his iPad. He's like, "Yes, let's go." And I'm like, "Perfect." And as he's navigating to the app, though, I see he like hangs his head. He drops his shoulders, and he's like, "But why were you crying anyway?" And his words catch me off guard because I didn't realize that my tears would land on him so heavily from the other room. And genuinely, I'm looking for something to tell him that is truthful but can get us to the game. And I can't figure out how to hold these two things, and so I realize that I have to just tell him the truth. And I know that sharing the video of the incident would be too much for a 5 and 8-year-old, and so I did want to share something. I ended up finding a reporter talking about the incident. And as soon as I found the one that I thought was age appropriate, I pulled my sons in closer and I said, I have to share something with you. It's going to be really hard for you to listen to, but it's important for you to hear. And I pulled my earphones out of the phone and I pushed play. And as soon as the news reporter starts describing the incident, I see my 8-year-old son on the bottom bunk with his knees curled to his chest and his hands over his head, and he's shaking violently. And he's not saying any words, but I can feel in his body that he's tensing up and holding his breath, trying to wait for this storm to pass. And so I push pause. And I tell him, it's really heavy, isn't it? And he nods his head, and right as he's nodding his head, I hear my 5-year-old. He's like, what do you mean heavy, Daddy? And I'm like, right, heavy is not enough language for a 5-year-old. And so I crawl closer to him on the blue and white area rug, and I put my hands on his chest and on his shoulders, and I say, I mean the emotions, the sadness, the grief. You can feel it in your body. It's kind of heavy, right? And my 5-year-old starts nodding his head, and he's like, yes. When my 8-year-old chimes in, he's like, maybe he can feel it, Dad, because we're both crying, but maybe he doesn't really fully understand what's happening. And I look at my 8-year-old, I'm like, I'm loving this co-parenting that's going on. And I look back at my 8-year-old, and I'm like, you're absolutely right. Maybe he doesn't fully understand what's happening, and maybe both of you are too young to have to deal with this, but I know you can both already feel this in your body. And when I was your age, I used to be just like you. I'd crawl up onto my bed, put my hands over my head, and try and push everything down that's going on. Everything that would come up in my life, I would try and push it down. And before I could get to my point, my 8-year-old cuts me off, and he's like, but Dad, that makes no sense. Because if you push everything down, that just means you have to carry it around with you everywhere you go. And my 8-year-old's words blow me out of the water because I realize that he is talking to the 6-year-old in me. There was a lot more connection that happened between me and my sons in that moment, but I want to make sure that my son's words to me land with any of you that have ever tried to push something down in your life. That if you try and push it down, you just have to carry it around with you everywhere you go. When I learned this lesson from my sons, I didn't really know what to do with it, but I wanted to stop having these things inside of my body, and so I started stepping on stages in New York City and sharing my story. And as I did, it felt this like liberating just air returning to my body. It was like the first time in my life that I was able to breathe through all of these storms. And I thought to myself, man, all those people who were talking about finding your voice were right. I should have listened way earlier. But it wasn't just that. As I started sharing my voice, I started to see all the ways that things from my past were impacting me in the present. And I started digging up the things from my life and sharing them on stages all over the world. I shared them in New York City, where I live, in Washington, in Virginia, in Michigan, California, and many states in between. I shared them internationally in Toronto and Senegal, going to parts of the world where I didn't even imagine I would ever go. I even found myself going onto online platforms, sharing my words so that millions of people could hear them. But it would take seeing my pain from the past show up in my son's life and my wife's life over and over before I could find the courage to finally have the conversation with my mom and my family about our traumas. But it's not just about me and my family, though. We all experience trauma. Whether it's the death of a loved one, global conflicts, calamity, sexual harassment, emotional or physical abuse, whether you've been abandoned by someone you love or betrayed, emotions, things that come up and overwhelm us are all around us. The problem is that so many people and cultures believe that the best way to deal with trauma is to not talk about it. We think that our silence will protect us, or that if we leave enough time between what's happened and now, that we'll be okay. But after 30 years of repressing my emotions and staying silent in my life, I can confidently tell you that not talking about the things that hurt doesn't make the hurt go away. It only means that it's growing inside you and being passed to the people around you. When I finally discovered this for myself, I finally wanted to be able to acknowledge that this was a real problem in my life. But it's not just anecdotal evidence. Research is actually supporting this. What researchers have found that while emotional suppression and staying silent may provide temporary relief, they actually have many risks, including increased stress, anxiety, and depression, reduced job satisfaction and relationship satisfaction, even reduced work productivity, even physical things to our bodies, increased rates of cardiovascular disease, and a weakened immune functions. To me, as I started to listen to this side effects, I realized that I was actually living in one of those late night pharmaceutical commercials. I didn't want to do that in my life anymore, and I don't want you to do that either. I want us to all to take a moment right now to take a deep breath together. Let's all inhale and exhale. One more time. Inhale and exhale. After you've been holding your breath and trying to survive through these storms, being able to breathe feels amazing. And starting your healing journey feels like your life is changing. But I don't want us to stop there. A lot of people, when they talk about trauma, they talk about healing like it's the end destination. But I actually know that there's a world beyond that. And it's the same as if you think about pulling your head out of the water when you're drowning. Getting air in your lungs feels great, but it's not the same as being back in the boat. And I think we can get back in the boat and set a new course for our life. And that's where the power of a single voice comes in. I've had many experiences with the power of a single voice firsthand, but one of the most memorable happened on a sunny day in May of 2023. I was in Toronto facilitating a storytelling workshop with a group of 3 different middle schools. I was there sharing stories from my life. I had a co-facilitator and friend sharing stories through his life through music, because I really wanted the students to understand that you have to share your stories, but you can find many ways to share your stories. And so I'm getting to the end of the session. I've been sharing a few different personal moments from my life, and I've come to the part where I call out for volunteers to come to the front. Don't worry, I'm not going to ask you to come to the front right now. But I did ask those students to come to the front, and as I look out into the audience, not a single hand is raised. It's completely silent. I've always thought to myself, when people say you can hear a pin drop, that's so silly. But I could hear my heart pounding in my chest. I was so nervous because I had built everything up to this moment, hoping at least one student would come to the front, and nobody is raising their hand. And I'm thinking to myself, man, this was a bad idea. How am I going to pivot to the next thing? When I see a hand go up slowly in the back. I call this student to the front, take a deep breath, and I see how nervous he is, and I just encourage him. It doesn't have to be the biggest thing, just to openly share from his life. And this student, he opens up, shares this moment from his life, and sure enough, it's not the biggest thing, and it's not a traumatic thing, it's just something that was significant to him. And as he gets to the end, I thank him, and he starts walking back to his seat as I open up the floor for others to share. And I see 10 hands shoot up. And I call this student back up to the front, and I turn him around, and I tell him, I just wanted to make sure that you understand the power of your voice. That initially, when I asked for volunteers, there was not a single person who raised their hand. And now after you've shared, there's 10 people willing to share. And this student, he asked me if he can say one more thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, sure. And he pounds his chest and he said, they didn't believe in us, but God did. Everybody laughs, and it's this really powerful moment. We have a week in Toronto of much more connection, but I really want to make sure the words that I said to this student land with you. That if you openly and honestly share from your life, you won't even be healing yourself, but you'll be inspiring others to transform as well. It's this powerful ripple effect, and I've seen it all over the world. I saw it when I was in India, talking to an engineer who, after the devastating loss of his father, was able to join a group of innovators who were changing the lives of millions of Indians just like his family. I saw it in Senegal and in Kenya, talking to social activists who were talking about gender-based violence, sexual violence, medical abuse, and inequalities in their communities. But they weren't just talking about the trauma from their lives. They were reclaiming the narratives and transforming their community. I also even saw it in Inner Mongolia, China, where I was talking to a group of doctors who noticed that a virus in one province, and they started to do a program in that province to meet this virus, but then that program got expanded from province to province after province until 100,000 women's lives were being saved from cervical cancer. All because one person decided to take what had been a point of pain and transform it into a platform for connection and transformation. Now, if you're thinking to yourself, well, I'm not an engineer, I'm not a social activist, I'm not a doctor, you might be thinking, what can my voice do? And I don't want to give you a 7, 10-step strategy about how to find your voice and activate the power, because everything that you need is already inside of you. Just like that little 6-year-old inside of me finally was able to speak, you have that little voice inside of you as well. All you have to do is be willing to search in the dark corners of your past for things you've been avoiding. And instead of ignoring them, Speak them. It doesn't have to be on a stage where you're bearing your heart to the entire world. It could be something as simple as talking to your friends about what you're actually going through, or your siblings or your coworkers. Now, I'm not going to lie to you and tell you that it's going to be easy. A lot of people, when they talk about pain and you get past the pain, they tell you to look around and see how small that thing was. And actually, for me, the thing that I was most afraid of was as big as I thought it was and actually bigger. But what didn't occur to me was that I was bigger than I had thought. When I finally spoke up to my mom, seeing tears come into my mom's eyes and to know that I was the one who was making her relive that moment in her life was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. And as painful as it was for both of us, it brought us closer together than we had ever been before. It was really challenging for me to make my mom go to that place, but once I did, my mom shared things with me about her childhood that I'd never heard about her brothers that I had never heard. She even shared a piece that she had written, and I didn't even know that my mom wrote. It was this really powerful moment. Now, I don't want you to think that our lives have to be cloaked in the darkness from our past. Me and my mom have had some amazing moments together, whether it was at the happiest place on earth, dressing up for school projects, or who can remember this classic moment with a black Santa, woman with a beard and a baby. Me and my mom have had some wonderful moments together. But I also want you to be able to talk about the dark things from your past, because if you don't, you will lose parts of yourself like I did. When I had been saying my whole life, my mom's youngest brother, not remembering that it was actually my uncle, somebody who lived with me when I was born, and who lived next door to me until the day that he died. All I had to do was find the courage to speak up. And if you're still thinking to yourself, yeah, I hear the power, it's great, but what power do I have? I want to leave this one last thing with you. I recently came across this interesting bit of research. Oceanographers discovered that the ocean's currents are split into two main groups, what they call the surface currents and the deep ocean currents. The surface currents control the motion of the top 10% of the ocean's water, whereas the deep ocean currents mobilize the other 90%. But what's interesting is how they play off each other. They discovered that as wind blows along the ocean's surface, it pulls on the top layer of the ocean's waters. And that top layer pulls on the layer beneath it. And that layer pulls on the layer beneath it. So that until the point where the wind at the ocean's surface is actually being felt 400 meters deep. When I thought about this in relation to the ocean, I thought that was incredible. But when I started to think about that in relation to myself, my sons, my family, that boy in Toronto, and the ripple effect I've seen all over the world, it occurred to me that each of us has the power to make the same motion. By speaking and influencing the people around us, we can move like the ocean. I want you to understand the power of your voice, that all it takes is a single voice to break the intergenerational and cultural silence, and to ask others to join in the wave. Your voice can be the single voice. Thank you.